What if the best burger you ever tasted wasn't beef? Imagine walking into a restaurant, the scent of smoked meat pulling you in, the promise of a meal so rich, so flavorful, it lingers on your tongue long after the last bite. You take your seat, order the house special, tender, juicy, unlike anything you've ever had before. And as you finish, as you lean back with a satisfied sigh, you don't question it. You don't ask what made it taste so different. No one did. For years, customers raved about his food. Critics called it perfection, the kind of flavor that keeps you coming back, craving more. But behind the scenes, behind the charm of a smiling chef and his warm, welcoming restaurant, was a secret too horrifying to comprehend. Because what they were eating wasn't what they thought it was. For one woman, the truth came too late. Renee Bennett had built a life beside her husband, trusting the man she once loved. But one night, curiosity led her into a place she was never supposed to be. A single step into a cold, metal freezer, a single glance at what lay beneath the plastic-wrapped packages, and she saw something that no one was ever meant to see. By then, she had already made her mistake. How did a respected chef turn his kitchen into a butcher shop of horrors? And more importantly, how many people unknowingly took a bite of his crimes? Tell me in the comments, would you ever eat at a restaurant again if you found out something like this had happened in your city? Stay with me. Because what happened next will change the way you look at food forever. Bennett's Smokehouse and Grill was more than just a restaurant. It was an experience, a place where people lined up for hours, waiting to sink their teeth into what was widely considered the best burger in Florida. The kind of meal that left an impression, that made you close your eyes with the first bite and savor flavors so rich, so impossibly satisfying, that they lingered long after the plate was empty. No one questioned why it tasted different. They simply craved more. Food critics called it unmatched. Influencers raved about it, flooding social media with glowing reviews, their cameras capturing perfectly seared patties glistening under restaurant lights. Some claimed the secret lay in the seasoning, others in the way the meat melted effortlessly on the tongue. Whatever the reason, one thing was certain, Bennett's Smokehouse had become legendary. And at the center of it all was Marcel Bennett. To customers, he was a master of his craft, a chef with an unwavering commitment to quality. To his staff, he was demanding, precise, someone who expected nothing less than perfection. But long before the fame, before the restaurant, before the name Bennett became synonymous with fine dining, there was a boy. A boy raised in an environment most would never understand. Marcel grew up surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of a butcher shop. His father, Clyde Bennett, ran a meat processing business, a place where raw cuts were prepared with speed and precision, where knives never stopped moving, where the air was thick with the scent of iron and bleach. Most children played outside, rode their bikes, scraped their knees on pavement. Marcel learned how to separate flesh from bone. He spent his early years standing on a wooden crate just to reach the stainless steel counters, watching as his father demonstrated the techniques that had been passed down for generations. Clean cuts, controlled movements, efficiency above all else. Clyde was a hard man, his expectations firm. Mistakes weren't tolerated. Hesitation was weakness. And Marcel learned quickly. By the time he was 10, he could break down an entire carcass faster than most seasoned workers. By 12, he understood which blades worked best for different textures, which pressure points drained a body the quickest. By 14, his hands worked on instinct, as if they had been made for one thing and one thing only. Cutting. His father never spoke about where the extra shipments came from, the ones that arrived late at night, wrapped tightly in black plastic. He never explained why the back door was locked after closing, why strangers came and left without saying a word. But Marcel didn't need explanations. He understood. And he never asked. When Clyde Bennett vanished without a trace, no one searched for him. The business changed hands, debts were settled, and life moved on. But Marcel had already absorbed everything he needed to know. And when the time came to step out of the shadows and build something of his own, he had one goal. Control. His journey into the culinary world wasn't immediate. First came the training, the years spent under the guidance of respected chefs, the lessons in flavor, balance, and presentation. He studied the art of seasoning, the chemistry of marination, the science behind the perfect sear. He worked his way through kitchens, absorbing knowledge, sharpening not just his knives, but his understanding of what made food unforgettable. But something was missing. No matter how skilled he became, no matter how many restaurants he worked in, nothing gave him the same satisfaction he had felt in his father's shop. Nothing compared to the weight of a blade in his hand, the feeling of flesh yielding beneath his touch. Cooking was an art, but butchery, true butchery, was power. When he finally opened Bennett's Smokehouse and Grill, it was an instant success. The menu was crafted with precision, the recipes carefully developed to ensure every bite was flawless. But behind the perfectly plated meals, behind the closed doors of the kitchen, there were rules. Marcel handled the meat himself. Always. No supplier names were disclosed. No deliveries were made in daylight. Employees followed orders without question, because questioning things led to termination. And Marcel made it clear, this was his business. His kitchen. His rules. Customers kept coming, drawn in by the allure of something they couldn't quite put into words. They raved about the richness, the tenderness, the almost addictive quality of his food. And no one ever wondered why. Do you think a person's childhood can shape them into something unnatural? Let me know in the comments. Marcel Bennett was a man who understood control. He built his reputation on it. He ruled his kitchen with precision, dictated every detail of his restaurant's operation, and demanded absolute obedience from those who worked under him. But when it came to his personal life, control meant something different. It meant ownership. Renée Dupree met Marcel when she was 21. At the time, she was working as a waitress in a high-end steakhouse in Miami, balancing trays of overpriced entrees while listening to men in tailored suits discuss business over rare cuts of meat. She was ambitious, determined to build something of her own, but life had other plans the night Marcel Bennett walked through the doors. He wasn't like the other men who dined there. He didn't try too hard to impress, didn't throw his wealth around like the regulars who expected attention the moment they walked in. Marcel didn't need to. The moment he entered, people noticed him. They moved aside. The manager, a man who rarely left his office, came out personally to greet him. The kitchen staff straightened up, working faster. Conversations grew quieter. It was the way he carried himself, the kind of presence that made people respect him without him saying a word. And Renée found herself captivated. She had seen powerful men before. Miami was filled with them. But Marcel had something different, something that drew her in without effort. It wasn't just the money, though he had plenty of it. It was the way he made people listen, the way he spoke as if every word was calculated, deliberate. The way his eyes lingered just long enough to let her know he had already decided. When he left that night, he left with her number. Their romance was fast. Swept up in Marcel's world, Renée barely had time to catch her breath. One moment, she was struggling to pay rent in a cramped apartment, the next, she was dining in exclusive restaurants, slipping into designer dresses, waking up in silk sheets inside a home she never imagined she could afford. Marcel didn't just spoil her. He elevated her. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his. By the time he proposed, she said yes without hesitation. For a while, their life felt like a dream. A beautiful home just outside the city. Luxury cars. Weekend getaways to private resorts. A restaurant that only continued to grow in popularity. To everyone looking in, they were the perfect couple. But perfection is often an illusion, and illusions only last as long as no one looks too closely. The cracks in their marriage didn't appear all at once. They started small, subtle enough that Renée didn't recognize them for what they were. Rules. At first, they seemed like harmless preferences. She wasn't allowed in his restaurant's kitchen, it was a professional workspace, he didn't want distractions. She was never to question where the restaurant's ingredients came from. He had exclusive suppliers, and the details weren't important. If deliveries were late, if inventory seemed off, if employees came and went without warning, she wasn't supposed to ask why. Somewhere along the way, trust had been replaced with obedience. At first, she accepted it. Marcel was protective. He was private. He was building something important, and she didn't need to concern herself with the logistics of his business. But the longer they were together, the more those rules started to feel like boundaries, and boundaries meant barriers. Marcel had locked her out of part of his life. And for the first time, Renee wondered what it was he didn't want her to see. Her unease grew with time. It wasn't just the secrecy, it was the way Marcel handled confrontation. If she ever pushed too hard, questioned something too much, the response was never explosive. It was measured. A lingering look. A quiet pause. A response so calm, so cold, that it left no room for discussion. The message was clear: don't ask again. But then, Lisa Dupree disappeared. Lisa had always been the skeptical one. She had never fully trusted Marcel, never bought into his charm the way Renee had. She wasn't impressed by the wealth, the status, the effortless way he commanded a room. Instead, she watched him. Listened to the way he spoke. Paid attention to the things he never said, and she had questions. Lisa had visited Bennett's smokehouse the week before she vanished. She had sat at one of the corner tables, picking at her food while watching Marcel work the room. When Renee joined her, Lisa had leaned in close, her voice low. "Doesn't anything about this place seem strange to you?" Renee had laughed it off, brushing away her concerns. But Lisa wasn't joking. "Have you ever wondered where he gets his meat?" "What are you talking about?" "I mean, really wondered. Have you seen any deliveries? Have you met any of his suppliers?" Renee had waved her off. Lisa had always been the kind of person who looked for problems where there weren't any. But that night, as they hugged goodbye, Lisa had said something that settled in Renee's stomach like a weight. "Just be careful. He's not who you think he is." And then, just days later, she was gone. No calls. No texts. No one knew where she had gone. Her apartment was undisturbed, her belongings untouched. One day, she was there. The next, it was as if she had never existed. Renee was devastated. But Marcel? Marcel barely reacted. "It's Miami," he had said with a shrug. "People disappear all the time." And maybe they did. Maybe Lisa had run off, left without telling anyone. Maybe she had gotten involved with the wrong crowd, made enemies she couldn't escape. There were 100 logical reasons for her disappearance. But then Renee remembered something. Lisa had been asking questions about Marcel. About his business. About his restaurant. And for the first time since she had met him, a realization settled in her mind, chilling and undeniable. Every person who had ever questioned Marcel's business had one thing in common. They weren't around anymore. What would you do if you suspected your own spouse was hiding something horrifying? Confront them, or stay silent? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to support our effort by subscribing to this channel. It started with a smell. Renee had always been familiar with the scent of meat. She had spent years inside the walls of Bennett's smokehouse and grill, breathing in the rich aroma of slow-cooked brisket, the unmistakable tang of spices blended in just the right way. She knew the difference between fresh cuts and those that had lingered a little too long. But this? This was different. It was late. The restaurant had closed hours ago, yet something in the air felt off. The house was silent, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel magnified. Marcel was upstairs, asleep, his steady, unbothered breathing filling the space between them as Renee lay next to him, staring at the ceiling. The unease had settled in long before that night. Long before Lisa had vanished. Long before Renee had noticed that certain employees came and went without explanation, that deliveries never arrived through the front, that Marcel always had more meat stocked than seemed possible. But tonight was different. She slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, her pulse drumming in her ears as she moved through the dimly lit house. The scent grew stronger as she made her way downstairs, past the framed awards on the walls, past the sleek, modern kitchen that Marcel had always kept immaculate. And then she saw it. The back door. Unlocked. Marcel never left it that way. Never. Her breath hitched as she stepped outside, the night air thick and warm around her. The restaurant loomed in front of her, silent, waiting. Something inside her whispered, "Go back. Walk away. Forget what you think you know." But it was too late for that, wasn't it? She had to know. The kitchen was empty, its gleaming stainless steel counters reflecting the dim glow of the emergency exit light. She moved quietly, past the grill stations, past the prep tables where employees spent hours chopping vegetables, slicing meats, plating dishes that customers devoured without question. And then she reached the freezer. The door was slightly ajar. A shiver ran through her, the cold air wafting from within like a whisper, beckoning her closer. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, gripping the handle, pulling it open just enough to step inside. And that was when she saw them. Neatly stacked on industrial shelves, vacuum-sealed packages lined the walls. Dozens of them. Wrapped tightly, labeled in Marcel's precise handwriting. But these weren't marked beef. They weren't pork. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted across the labels. Left arm. Thigh. Torso. The world tilted beneath her feet. Her hands shook as she reached out, hesitating before grabbing one of the smaller packages. The plastic crinkled under her grip, the weight of it unnatural, wrong. And then she saw it. A gold bracelet. Dangling beneath the fluorescent light, its delicate chain twisted around the edge of a package marked Lisa. She staggered back, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. This wasn't just Marcel's secret. This was his business. Lisa was here. Not buried. Not missing. Not somewhere out in the world, living a life no one knew about. Lisa had been processed. Lisa had been served. And people had eaten her. Her stomach twisted violently, nausea rising in her throat as her mind fought against the truth laid out before her. This wasn't a one-time thing. This wasn't a mistake. Marcel had been doing this for years. Every person who had ever disappeared, every supplier no one ever met, every late-night shipment she had ignored, had ended up here. On these shelves. On those plates. In the stomachs of customers who had walked in, sat down, and unknowingly become part of his crimes. Renee's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed toward the door, her vision swimming. She needed to run. To get out. To call someone, anyone. But in that moment, she made a fatal mistake. She thought she still had time to escape. She forced herself to breathe, to move slowly, to slide the freezer door shut without a sound. Her heart pounded as she retraced her steps, slipping back through the restaurant, past the stainless steel counters that now seemed stained with unseen horrors. The scent of smoked meat, once comforting, now turned her stomach. By the time she reached their house, her hands were trembling so badly she struggled to fit the key into the lock. The moment she stepped inside, she forced herself to pause. She couldn't let Marcel see her like this. She had to act normal. If he suspected anything, if he even had an inkling that she knew, she wouldn't live long enough to do anything about it. She wiped her hands against her dress, steadied her breathing, and climbed the stairs as quietly as she could. Marcel hadn't moved. His breaths were slow, even. She slipped under the covers beside him, rigid, unable to close her eyes. She needed a plan. She would go to the police first thing in the morning. She would tell them everything, show them what she had found. They would handle it from there. That was their job. But the more she thought about it, the more her stomach twisted. Marcel was well connected. He knew people. He had built a business on secrecy, control, and absolute authority over everything he touched. She couldn't risk making a mistake. So she decided to wait. She would act normal. Pretend nothing had changed. And the moment she had the chance, she would turn him in. But Marcel Bennett hadn't built his empire by being careless. The moment the sun rose, she knew something was wrong. He was awake before her, moving through the house with a stillness that put her on edge. When she walked into the kitchen, he was already seated at the table, sipping his coffee, watching her. And that was when she realized, he knew. She tried to keep her hands steady as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her back turned to him, her mind racing. She could feel his eyes on her, studying her, analyzing every detail. He knew her better than anyone. He could read her like a book. She forced herself to sit across from him, wrapping her hands around the mug, willing them to stop shaking. She had to act like nothing had changed. But when he slid a plate in front of her, 2 perfectly cooked eggs, a side of bacon, toast, the way he had always prepared it for her, her stomach clenched. She couldn't eat. She stared at the food, her pulse hammering, bile rising in her throat. And Marcel noticed. He tilted his head slightly, setting his cup down, his expression unreadable. "You're not hungry?" Renee's throat was dry. She forced a tight smile. "Not really, I think I'm coming down with something." A long pause. Then, so casually it sent a chill through her, he said, "You went into the freezer last night, didn't you?" Her blood turned ice cold. She tried to deny it, tried to shake her head, but the words wouldn't come. Marcel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his fingers laced together as he watched her. There was no anger in his voice, no urgency. Just quiet certainty. "So, what exactly do you plan to do with that information, baby?" She had never felt terror like this. He wasn't asking because he was curious. He wasn't trying to figure out how much she knew. He was waiting. Measuring. Calculating how much time he had before he had to act. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table, her mind racing for an answer, for anything that would buy her time. But Marcel wasn't the kind of man who left room for mistakes. One moment, she was sitting at the table. The next, the chair was flying backward as his hands wrapped around her throat, shoving her against the kitchen wall. The impact sent shockwaves through her skull, stars bursting behind her eyes. She gasped, clawing at his grip, her nails digging into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He squeezed tighter, his face just inches from hers, his breathing steady, controlled. "Do you know what the problem is with people like you?" he murmured, almost thoughtful. "You don't know when to stop asking questions." She thrashed, kicking, twisting, trying to free herself, but he was stronger. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred, black spots creeping in at the edges. The strength in her limbs started to fade, her hands falling away from his grip. And then, just as suddenly as he had grabbed her, he let go. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, coughing, her lungs burning. She tried to crawl away, but before she could move, a sharp pain erupted in her abdomen. She looked down. A knife. Her own blood seeped through her fingers as she grabbed at the wound, her breath hitching, her vision swimming. Marcel crouched in front of her, tilting his head as he wiped his hands on a dish towel. "I told you, baby," he murmured. "You should have stayed out of my business." The world tilted. Her body hit the cold tile. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was Marcel, calmly finishing his coffee. If you were in her position, would you try to run, or fight back? Tell me your thoughts. Also, if you condemn merciless action against Renee or any of its kind, subscribe to this channel. Renee lay on the kitchen floor, her breath slowing, her body still. He watched her for a long moment, waiting, listening. When he was sure she was gone, he exhaled, standing up, stretching his fingers, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for just another shift at the restaurant. There was no hesitation. No emotion. Just another problem that needed to be cleaned up. He worked quickly, rolling up his sleeves, taking a final sip of his coffee before crouching down to get started. First, he grabbed her ankles, dragging her across the tile, leaving a thick, wet streak behind her. The back door swung open with ease, the humid Florida air pressing in as he pulled her into the butchering room behind the restaurant. This was his real kitchen, the one no one ever saw, the one no one ever questioned. The stainless steel table stood in the center of the room, waiting. He heaved her onto it with practiced ease. Then he got to work. The blade slid through skin effortlessly, parting flesh with a precision that only years of experience could perfect. Tendons, joints, muscle, he knew exactly where to cut, exactly how much pressure to apply. This wasn't new to him. This was second nature. He worked methodically, without waste, without unnecessary movement. Her limbs separated at the joints, stacked neatly in a row. The torso required more effort, but he had done this before. Every step was measured, careful. Nothing was left to chance. The hours passed in silence, interrupted only by the steady rhythm of his blade. When he was finished, the pieces were wrapped, vacuum-sealed, labeled just like the others. But this time, there was no need to freeze them. This time, there was another plan. The next morning, the restaurant opened as usual. The kitchen staff arrived, prepping for another busy day. They didn't ask questions when Marcel handed them the fresh supply of meat. They didn't wonder why he was the one to bring it in, why it hadn't come from their usual suppliers. All they knew was that today's special was something new. Marcel named it the signature burger. A limited time offering. A unique blend of flavors. Juicy, rich, perfectly seasoned. The kind of dish that would keep people talking. And it did. Customers raved about it. The moment the first plates hit the tables, the reactions were immediate. This is the best thing I've ever tasted. What kind of meat is this? It's so tender. Please tell me this is staying on the menu. Marcel watched them eat, watched as they licked their fingers, as they chewed slowly, savoring the experience. They had no idea. No idea that they were consuming the very woman who had once lived in his house, who had shared his bed, who had spoken his name in trust. The critics loved it. Reviews poured in, praising the complexity of the flavor, the buttery texture, the depth of the seasoning. Food bloggers posted photos, influencers recorded reaction videos, customers returned for second helpings. And through it all, Marcel sat at his usual table, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. Then, when the time was right, he ordered one for himself. The plate was placed in front of him, the patty glistening, the scent rising in warm waves. He picked up the burger, examining it for a moment, his fingers pressing lightly into the toasted bun. Then he took a bite. The flavors exploded on his tongue. The familiar richness. The undeniable tenderness. The perfect balance of seasoning and fat. He chewed slowly, savoring each second. And when he swallowed, he smiled. Bennett's Smokehouse and Grill had never been busier. The signature burger had drawn in a crowd like never before. Lines stretched down the block, customers impatiently waiting for a taste of what food critics were calling the most unique and unforgettable dish in Florida. People traveled from out of state just to try it, posting pictures of their plates, sharing videos of their reactions, telling their friends that they had just eaten the best burger of their lives. Marcel moved through his restaurant as if nothing had changed, shaking hands with regulars, nodding at his chefs, watching as each plate left the kitchen. He had always prided himself on control, and at that moment, he had it. There was no suspicion, no whispers, no reason for anyone to question the success of his exclusive new recipe. But secrets don't stay buried forever. The first crack in his perfect system came in the form of a routine inspection. It was supposed to be quick. The health department did random checks all the time, making sure food establishments followed regulations. But this time, Marcel hadn't been expecting them. Andrew Frankie had just started working as a health inspector for Miami-Dade County. He was young, eager, determined to do his job right. He had no idea what he was about to walk into when he arrived at Bennett's smokehouse. At first, everything seemed normal. The restaurant was spotless, the kitchen organized. But as he moved through the back rooms, clipboard in hand, checking expiration dates, logging inventory, something caught his attention. The freezer door. It was slightly ajar. A place like this, high standards, top reputation, a chef known for his flawless execution, shouldn't have a freezer left open. That was a basic violation. But the moment Andrew stepped closer, the violation was the least of his concerns. The smell hit him first. Not the scent of smoked meats or aging beef. This was different. Thick, pungent, unnatural. He hesitated for only a second before reaching for the handle, pulling the heavy metal door open. And then he saw them. Rows of vacuum-sealed packages, carefully stacked, meticulously labeled. At first glance, they looked like any other high-end cuts of meat. But as his eyes scanned the shelves, his stomach lurched. The labels didn't say beef. They didn't say pork. They said thigh. They said torso. And then, scrawled across one of the packages in black marker, was a name. René. Andrew staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. His mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing, but the realization hit him like a freight train. He had to call it in. Within the hour, police swarmed the restaurant. They blocked off the entrances, ushered customers out, questioned employees. And inside that freezer, the truth was laid bare. Marcel had been serving his victims. Investigators moved quickly, collecting the packaged remains, sending samples for DNA testing. The results were undeniable. The flesh inside those vacuum-sealed bags wasn't animal. It was human. And among the samples, they found matches for at least 12 missing people, people who had vanished without a trace over the past 2 years. One of them was René. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcel Bennett was arrested on site, led through the back doors of his own restaurant in handcuffs, past a crowd of horrified customers and flashing news cameras. And through it all, he remained silent, his face unreadable. The trial was the most talked about case in Florida's history. The courtroom was packed every day, the media covering every detail, true crime enthusiasts dissecting every piece of information. Families of the victims sat in the front row, clutching tissues, waiting for answers. The world wanted to know why. Marcel showed no remorse. He sat through testimonies, forensic evidence, witness statements, all without reaction. He listened as prosecutors detailed how he had lured his victims, how he had processed them in his private butchering room, how he had turned them into the meals people couldn't stop talking about. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the judge asked him if he had anything to say before sentencing, he finally spoke. His voice was calm. Collected. Unbothered. People loved my food. That's all that matters. The room fell into stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone started sobbing. Marcel didn't blink. His sentence, death. The restaurant was shut down, condemned, and eventually burned to the ground. But the memory of what happened there, that would never disappear. How many people unknowingly ate his victims? How many had taken a bite of something they never could have imagined? And the worst part? They would never know. Marcel spent 3 years on death row. 3 years confined to a small, windowless cell, surrounded by others waiting for their own executions. But unlike most inmates, Marcel never seemed to feel the weight of his sentence. He didn't pace. He didn't lash out. He never begged for a reduced sentence or filed an appeal. He never once claimed innocence or fought to save his life. Instead, he waited. Prison guards observed his behavior closely, expecting the usual breakdowns that came with men facing their final days. But Marcel never wavered. He kept to himself, silent most of the time, except for one peculiar habit. He whispered to his meals. They noticed it during the first few weeks. He would sit in his cell, plate in front of him, his lips moving just barely as he cut into his food. The words were too low to hear, but the rhythm was steady, deliberate, as if he were carrying on a private conversation. Some guards dismissed it as meaningless rambling, but others weren't so sure. It was as if, even in confinement, he was still in his restaurant, still running his kitchen, still feeding people in a way only he understood. When questioned about it, he only smiled. He had nothing to confess. Nothing to regret. And when inmates shouted threats at him from their own cells, calling him a monster, a butcher, a disgrace to humanity, Marcel never reacted. He only ate his meals slowly, methodically, as if he was savoring something no one else could taste. As his execution date approached, the warden asked if he had any final requests. He was allowed one last meal, anything he wanted. Marcel made his decision without hesitation. A rare steak. The choice unsettled even the most hardened prison staff. It was too deliberate. Too on the nose. The night of his execution, they brought the tray to his cell. A thick cut of steak, barely cooked, resting in its own juices. A side of roasted potatoes, a glass of water. Nothing extravagant. Nothing absurd, just one final meal. Marcel lifted the fork, cutting into the meat with slow, precise movements, pressing it against his tongue, chewing with a patience that made the guards uncomfortable. He ate the entire thing without a word, savoring every bite until nothing remained but the empty plate. Then he leaned back in his chair, wiped his mouth with the napkin, and smirked. One last taste. Those were the only words he spoke that night. When the time came, they led him to the execution chamber. The witnesses had already gathered, journalists, lawyers, families of the victims, people who had spent years waiting for this moment. Some had tears in their eyes. Others sat rigid, their fists clenched in their laps. They wanted closure. They wanted an apology. They wanted to see something, anything, that would make him human. But Marcel gave them nothing. As they strapped him down, as the warden asked if he had any final words, he looked out at the faces watching him, scanning the room with an expression so composed, so eerily calm, that it sent a shudder through those expecting to see even the slightest trace of regret. He smiled. "You all loved my food," he said, voice smooth, deliberate. "And you'll never know how much of it was really me." A gasp rippled through the room. Someone in the audience let out a choked sob. One of the guards stiffened, his grip tightening on the restraints. And then the execution began. At 7:42 p.m., Marcel Bennett was pronounced dead. His body was cremated, his ashes discarded in an undisclosed location, forgotten by the world, at least, in the physical sense. But what he left behind? That would never be erased. The restaurant was demolished, burned to the ground in an attempt to erase the horror that had once lived within its walls. But the memories couldn't be burned away. The customers who had once lined up for his legendary meals could never forget what they had unknowingly taken part in. How many had sat at his tables, laughing with their families, slicing into steaks, biting into burgers, raving about the richness, the tenderness, the flavor that they couldn't find anywhere else. How many had unknowingly eaten his victims? How many had eaten Renee? For some, the knowledge was too much to bear. They sought therapy, haunted by the thought of what they had consumed. Others swore off eating meat altogether, unable to stomach the idea of touching another burger, another steak. But there were those who had raved about his food, those who had claimed it was the best they had ever tasted, who lived with a different kind of horror. The fear that they had liked it too much. And the worst part? They would never know the truth. Marcel is gone, his ashes scattered, his name forever attached to one of the most horrifying crimes ever committed in the food industry. But the terror he created? That lingers. This wasn't a horror movie. This wasn't a plot from a crime thriller. This happened. Real people sat in that restaurant, placed their orders, chewed slowly, savoring each bite, completely unaware that they were eating human flesh. completely unaware that the chef who served them had taken lives and turned them into his specialty dishes. People who once raved about his food now live with the unbearable thought, how many times had they been to Bennett's smokehouse and grill? How many meals had they ordered? Had they unknowingly consumed someone they had walked past on the street, someone who had smiled at them in passing, someone who had simply gone missing one day? That thought alone is enough to make even the strongest stomachs turn. Some of those customers swore off meat altogether, unable to erase the images of the vacuum-sealed packages labeled thigh, torso, Renee. Some turned to therapy, overwhelmed by the idea that they had been part of something so disturbing, so beyond comprehension, that no amount of explanation could make it feel real. And yet, it was real. Even after the trial, even after the execution, one question continues to haunt the minds of those who ate at his restaurant: what if I liked it? Because that's what makes this case different from others. Serial killers have walked among us, have lived double lives, have hidden their crimes in ways no one ever suspected. But Marcel Bennett fed his crimes to the world. And they enjoyed it. Would you ever be able to eat at a restaurant again without wondering, what's really in your food? If this case left you speechless, subscribe for more stories exposing the darkest crimes in history. Hit the like button if this story shook you to your core. And share this video, because some stories should never be forgotten.